to another edition of Expert Q&A here on Up and to the Right. And I'm really excited because today we're actually going to get to talk a little bit more detail about some tech-related things. So I want to introduce you to Stan Coville with CapTech. So Stan, give folks a little introduction to yourself and to CapTech, if you would.
Sure. Thanks, Hayes. And first of all, thanks for having me on, giving me the opportunity to take a break a little bit from the day job and geek out a little bit. Always enjoy that opportunity. So Stan Coville, I am based in Columbus, Ohio, and director at CapTech and co-lead of our Salesforce service offering. Our firm nationally has 8 what we consider our local offices in a couple of major markets, mostly in kind of the Midwest and East Coast. About 1,000 consultants nationally. Our Salesforce practice, I was looking up these stats today. We have 31 individuals in our Salesforce practice, just technical individuals, with 78 Salesforce certifications across that group. We do mainly Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, CPQ, recently rebranded to Revenue Cloud, as well as some Financial Service Cloud and kind of the other tangential clouds that they've rebranded recently. That's it for myself and CapTech.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I saw the Revenue Cloud rebrand. I guess it's everything's got to have cloud after it, or it wouldn't be Salesforce. So obviously we're going to focus a lot on Salesforce today, since that's the the practice that you head up. And I think I want to start, like I said, at sort of the high level and talk about it really from a CRO perspective, right? And so, if you put on your chief revenue officer hat, your VP of sales hat, what should you really be thinking about now when it comes to Salesforce besides just the bill, which I kind of feel like is where a lot of leaders end up is, Salesforce is my database. People have to deal with it. We just kind of have to live with that. And oh, by the way, I don't want to spend as much as I do on it, but we need everybody to stay coordinated there. So, how should I be approaching that as a modern revenue leader?
Sure. So ultimately, it is at the heart of it a basic CRM tool, but I think the best way to view it is how it fits into an enterprise strategy from a business perspective and also an IT perspective. What does your enterprise data structure look like, and how does Salesforce augment that? How does Salesforce automate it? For example, we go into a lot of customers where Salesforce is the system of record for customer, for contact, for so many other kind of objects, you might call them, or ideas of data structures. Others, it's just a consumer of all that data and isn't necessarily well integrated. So from a CRO perspective, I would think about how can I save my salespeople time? How can I save my employees time, make them more efficient, make sure they're focusing on the right things, and allow some intelligent Salesforce automation and all the things that the Salesforce platform provides to truly allow them to be more efficient and focus on the things that matter, but also for data enrichment. So when I'm integrated into larger enterprise business processes and also IT processes and data structures, how is the data that I am being provided as a leader, my other managers, and ultimately my salespeople, how is that data being enriched to allow them to make the most intelligent decisions, being selling in the most intelligent ways, targeting the most targeting prospects in the most intelligent way possible. Overall, just using the platform, the data and automation that's available to be as efficient as possible. That's what I would say.
Okay, so I think this, thinking about Salesforce as part of a larger, ecosystem and kind of constellation of business applications is, I think, increasingly important. So I'm talking about it I talk about it as a CRO, but I think, CTOs, CIOs, sort of the rest of the organization probably has some level of connectivity into Salesforce. I mean, in some cases, the CIO may own Salesforce, but at a high level, from a sort of that overall C-suite perspective, how should I think about how Salesforce fits into that overall ecosystem. And we mentioned at the top of the call, all the different clouds and things like that. So Salesforce has this ever expanding footprint of things they can do. So, what's the right perspective to think about where Salesforce ends and the rest of my systems begin?
Sure. And I think that's, there's no hard and fast rule because ultimately Salesforce, through acquisition or through building themselves, they would love to own your entire enterprise, through whether it be CPQ plus billing, they'll be your ERP. They will use MuleSoft to integrate with any other backend systems you have and kind of be the hub of your entire enterprise architecture. Which I personally love working with all those tools, but ultimately that's a big price tag, as you mentioned. Right. So where does it end and where does it begin? I would say, how can it be that intelligent data hub to truly get it? It ultimately is a CRM. So focusing on the customer relationship and how Salesforce talks a lot about the 360-degree view of the customer. And that is, I think, what Salesforce does best. So how can I use the core Sales Cloud, Service Cloud, Marketing Cloud functionality to truly get a 360-degree view of my customer, and then use those things like the out-of-the-box APIs, maybe you have an existing middleware to connect to Salesforce and really enhance that data. I also think that Salesforce can really encompass a lot of tangential business processes to those core Sales and Service Cloud functionality. A great example for a global hotel brand, they do all of their franchisee engagement, application, all that stuff, all the legalese involved in that is done through Salesforce and through a Salesforce community that we actually were fortunate enough to build. That's a tangential business process, a completely custom data model, but very much, kind of tangential and adjacent to the traditional Sales and Service Cloud functionalities, but something that they saved money by building that on Salesforce instead of spending money on an additional franchise tool. So I would ultimately say that drawing a line around the customer experience and the 360-degree view of that data is where I would personally put Salesforce in the ecosystem.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting you mentioned the franchisee application. I feel like I'm increasingly seeing, as Salesforce gets more sophisticated, these pretty significant internal business applications that you wouldn't really think of as quote unquote CRM that get built on top of Salesforce. If I'm thinking about that strategically, when would I build an application on Salesforce versus when would I consider, purchasing something separately to do, say, franchisee application or something like that? Is there a particular, kind of a rubric you would use to make those decisions?
I would ultimately think about where the data lives. If you're just going to build a front-end application in Salesforce that is ultimately just going to be calling out to external APIs nonstop because that data lives elsewhere, let's say in the legacy Oracle database or something, that probably doesn't make much sense to live inside of Salesforce. You ultimately can do it. It would work perfectly fine if you want to expose it to a group of Salesforce users. Sure, you can do that. You can even use, and I'm sure we'll get into it later, Lightning Web Components you can use that, or you could use an Angular or React, any of the modern front-end frameworks inside of Salesforce perfectly easily. But the rubric I would use is ultimately, where does that data live? And then second, I would think about who needs to interact with it. So if the data already lives in Salesforce or a portion of it lives in Salesforce, and the users that are interacting with it already have Salesforce licenses, so I'm not going to take on additional licensing costs by putting that in Salesforce, I would say it probably makes sense to keep it in there as opposed to buying another tool.
Got it. Okay. Well, let's switch gears a little bit and I sort of think of it as moving down a level in the organization. So kind of moving down from the C-suite and the VP of sales sort of to usually where responsibility for Salesforce lives, which is somewhere in sales ops, but also potentially IT, and those sort of organizations I see a lot have ownership of a given Salesforce, org. So I want to talk a little bit about the team designs that you see as you work with different clients for how they structure, where admin responsibilities sit, where dev responsibilities sit, if they have Salesforce developers who are dedicated. What's the most common structure for that responsibility for CRM that you see?
Sure. And this is always a tough question, and one that we try to help solve at a lot of our clients is, who owns the system, and who ultimately, who maybe owns it from a cost perspective, but then who is the product owner? And
Right.
that is something that I think is really important to consider, is that if you think about your mobile app like a product, you think of your website as a product, that you probably have a actual product owner that is driving the product roadmap for that. There's no reason that Salesforce shouldn't be treated exactly like those things that you treat as products. At CapTech, we run everything in an agile framework, something we really believe in. We have product owners that we place on clients, but ultimately having a product owner at the client level has been really successful for us. And the model that we've seen work best in Salesforce is kind of IT owning the cost and maintenance of it as a product, just like they probably would with a mobile app or a website, or any other kind of web property. And then IT would also, inside of the IT organization, would probably be a Scrum team, or maybe a couple of Scrum teams that included admins and developers. And then there's ultimately a product owner. That product owner we've seen sit in IT successfully, but also sometimes sit on the business side successfully, where they kind of are the ones that are able to drive the roadmap from the business perspective into the IT team that's actually building the product. And I think the admin role is the one that's the most interesting for me, because Salesforce is really empowering admins in an incredible way. They talk about clicks, not code, almost nonstop, and how they can empower people and business users and turn them into almost software developers through tools like Flow that they're investing so much time and money in.
Can I ask a quick
So
question
kind of a
just real
yeah,
quick? Uh, we, as I have gotten deeper into the Salesforce ecosystem, we kind of have this intuitive sense of this is admin, this is development, right? For people who aren't as in tune with that, what is the distinction that you see between an admin and a developer in the
sure.
ecosystem?
That's a great distinction, Hayes. Thanks for pointing that out. Ultimately, a developer is someone who is writing, traditionally, a developer is someone who's writing code. An admin is someone who is using what I call the declarative tool set. That would be creating your objects and fields, and doing some automation functions around them through the Salesforce tools like workflow rules, process builders, and the new tool they use called Flow. Putting validations around fields. What fields show up on a page, for example, is something that an admin can easily control and enhance user experience that way. I will admit that the line between an admin and a dev is quickly blurring, mainly through that Flow tool. And there's so many ways now where your admins and devs need to sit side by side. And in my opinion, the best Salesforce functionality is built when combining the admin and dev functionality to make it usable and extensible in both the admin and dev realms. And to get back to your original question on kind of team structures, the way that we've seen it work best is almost where your admins sit both on the IT side and on the business side, where ultimately within your sales ops function, you would have a support team of admins that are able to quickly support your salespeople, run through support cases that probably live in Salesforce, or maybe another tool that you have within your enterprise to support the everyday functionality that sales users may run into issues with. But then ultimately kind of rotating the admins between the IT side, where they're actually developing roadmap features, and the support side to truly understand what the users are encountering on a day-to-day basis. So ultimately, Salesforce straddles this awkward fence of, does it live on the business side or does it live on the IT side? And the true answer is it needs to be owned by both, and it truly will function as the best product possible when both sides are bought in.
Yeah, I think that's certainly been my experience as well. And I certainly hesitate to split out the admin and the dev completely, right? Because if you don't have because that line is getting so blurry, right? If you don't have good communication between them, that kind of hinders some of the things that you want to do, which we might talk about a little bit later, especially as we get into like DevOps practices and things like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the admins do end up in an especially awkward place right now, and I don't know that that gets um, resolved per se, other than just through sort of discipline in the organization and an understanding that you have to have that type of communication. But I do want to talk about that product owner role, because this was something that in my past experience, I uh, it was something that people gave a lot of lip service to. Yes, we should have this product owner role, but it was hard to get it funded, to really get to have it understood as like there needs to be somebody who's thinking about the real product roadmap and actually the usage patterns and the user experience for your sellers. You know, if you were talking to somebody who was running maybe an ops team and was responsible for Salesforce, how would you tell them to pitch this role to their business?
I would pitch it to the business as this role will take the pressure off of your sales managers, your sales leadership team, and ultimately your sellers.
Hmm.
Because if you don't have someone sitting in this kind of product owner role, and
Right.
if you don't treat Salesforce like a true product, where you don't have probably a business analyst that might live with this product owner, or if you find that special someone that can play both those roles, if you don't have that, your Salesforce developers are going to be frequently just directly bothering your salespeople and preventing them from bringing in revenue for you.
Right.
And ultimately, your salespeople are going to tell the developers to go away because they need to focus on driving revenue and meeting their sales goals. Then your developers are going to deliver poor functionality to your salespeople, and ultimately it's just an inefficient system, and no one is benefiting, and the CRM is not it's not truly driving value in the way that you would hope it would. And then you start looking at the Salesforce price tag that you referenced at the beginning. So I think that product owner role can truly bridge that gap and make sure that everyone is as efficient as possible. And from the business perspective, you are coming at the question from ultimately, it allows your salespeople to do what they do best.
Okay. So I think that makes sense. So let's say I've got that. I make that pitch, and the business says, "Yeah, okay, let's get somebody in that role." Um, what are the right qualifications for that role? Because too often I feel like I see somebody who's basically a Salesforce admin kind of gets sort of tapped and said, "Okay, you're doing this now, right? You're gonna," and it's not necessarily the right fit, right? And it's
Yeah.
also I've also seen some struggles there where if you have somebody who is in this like sort of pure business analyst role and doesn't really understand Salesforce and the Salesforce ecosystem, it doesn't work all that great. So, uh, what are the right, what are the right qualifications if you're searching for somebody to have this role if you don't currently have somebody?
Sure. I would say that an understanding of the Salesforce platform is important, but in my opinion, not as important as understanding how sales works. We've seen a lot of successful and unsuccessful Salesforce implementations and process redesigns via Salesforce, where if it is driven by someone that is not truly well connected to the way that sellers actually sell within your organization. I mean, the sellers are ultimately your consumers of your CRM product. So if you're not truly in touch with them as a product owner, then I don't think you're able to truly do your job incredibly well. So in my opinion, the top qualification would be someone that understands the sales process well and is willing to kind of get their hands on with your sellers and understand how they live and work every day. And then secondarily, some understanding of Salesforce.
So let me layer on another little bit of complexity that I'm frequently hearing in conversations, which is, a lot of B2B organizations are trying to move to a much more product-led growth model. I was just on a call earlier today with some folks who were talking about, Salesforce is integrated with all their business systems, but not really integrated directly with their products right now. And so there's sort of this gap for like product metrics and things like that that they want to surface to the sellers. And I bring that up in sort of this team design, question, because I think increasingly, these organizations that are, you build around your CRM, they don't just have the sales organization as a stakeholder, they have other parts of the organization as well. So how do you, if you've worked in those types of environments where you have clients who have done the sort of PLG approach, how do you structure that team so that it integrates well with the other parts of the business that you might not traditionally associate with, Salesforce?
Sure. And I think that the classic Salesforce answer would be, Service Cloud and wanting to integrate some of the live chat functionality through your consumer facing product and gather feedback that way.
Right.
But ultimately, in my mind, it could be, there's a couple different flavors that could take, where, okay, I want to grab those product metrics, dump them into Salesforce to give a true 360-degree view of the customer, so that let's say if you were a SaaS company and you're selling a SaaS product, I can pump your product usage metrics on a per user basis and connect that to Salesforce contacts, so that when my sellers are selling to these contacts, I truly understand how much they use the system, maybe how many cases they have raised to our support team, what issues they might be having that I need to address in the sales process. But ultimately, then the product team can gather data from sales, from close loss metrics of, okay, what in product demos is not resonating with people that are trying to buy the product. So, and ultimately, through Salesforce tools like Tableau, through other data tools like Power BI, how can you make your Salesforce data extensible? So once I have that 360-degree view of the customer, whether that's within Salesforce or through a combination of Salesforce and other tools that I'm gathering data on my product usage, on my customer,
Right.
how can I surface that in an actionable way to all of these different stakeholders through some sort of dashboarding or data visualization tools? Did that get it, kind of the crux of the
I think
question?
that gets at more the kind of the technical side. Well, a little bit at the technical side, but one of the things I'm really interested in is how you structure teams and communication and sort of cadence of interactions to ensure that things don't get lost, right? Because it's when you have these, I've found at least, like the product team, like that's focused on your actual product, whatever it is you're selling, right, has their approach, their silo. They don't really think much about Salesforce, or they think about the sales process, but really only in the sense of, we need to build this product or this feature because sales, has said they need it, right? So everybody talks a
Yeah,
good
right.
game about like sharing information, but how do you really get those teams that live in pretty different worlds to effectively work together? Have you seen, is it sync meetings? Is it some sort of like a, business reviews or something? Like what do you see work in that regard?
I've seen it, a couple of the two things you mentioned, sync meetings and business reviews, ultimately they do work. I would, from in seeing one organization that did this really successfully, they had kind of product specialists in terms of sales that integrated frequently with sales and ultimately were working within the sales process.
Mhm.
However, then you're almost just kind of blending the teams, or you have certain product people that are working with sales. From a team structure, I would say that the best potential way I would solve it is to kind of use the admin rotation model that I mentioned, of
Mhm.
having product people rotate in with sales in terms of experiencing sales and experiencing the issues that salespeople are running into in selling your product. But I think these silos that you're talking about, whether it be a silo between IT and the business, or a silo within the business between sales and product, are really big organizational challenges that we're trying to help solve as CapTech, and I think that we don't yet have a perfect answer for, but a lot of meetings, a lot of cross communication, but ultimately a focus on specific data points is what would resonate with me, at least.
Yeah, I mean, If you did have the full solution to that, I'm imagining that that'd be pretty impressive. So I wasn't
Yeah.
necessarily expecting you to solve the world here, but yeah, I just think that as the complexity and the number of touch points grow in a customer life cycle, I mean, this is why Salesforce has their customer 360 pitch, right? It is um, there's so many things that you have to think of now that are interconnected in a way that maybe they weren't previously, right? Or you could get away without them being terribly tightly connected. So I just see so much inside revenue organizations, but inside organizations as a whole that needs to really be, I would call it sort of a mindset shift from like a vertical mindset of like we have this hierarchy and this hierarchy and this hierarchy of people to much more of a horizontal approach where how do we ensure that all the different parts of the organization are really aligned. And it's by no means an easy answer. And I think again it kind of goes back to that discipline of creating a culture where that's important and then doing it and practicing it every day. So it goes well beyond Salesforce specifically, because Salesforce lives at that nexus of so many different pieces across the customer lifecycle. It sort of exacerbates that problem I've found.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And a couple of things that I know we've been doing at CapTech a lot, because CapTech ultimately at the outset, I mentioned our Salesforce practice area. Our 1,000 consultants stretch across management consulting, systems integration, typical IT kind of consulting, and our data and analytics practice, as well as our customer experience practice, kind of our in-house agency. So we've been doing a lot of these things called hot houses recently, where essentially think of it like a quick corporate retreat almost, where you take all of your stakeholders, put them in a room, kind of isolate them, and ultimately just have everybody talk things out for a couple hours, have some facilitators that are going to really pull the questions and things out of people. Maybe that hothouse is centered around data metrics that you're getting from your product or from your sales organization. Maybe it's not data centric at all, and it's just, what are your priorities? What are your priorities? How do they align or misalign? And identifying all that stuff, and kind of taking a pause from your silos and having that kind of horizontally integrated approach. And even if it's kind of forcing that horizontal integration on a monthly cadence or a quarterly cadence of, let's make sure that we as an enterprise have a rational roadmap across all of these things. And then second, the second thing that comes to mind from a more technical perspective is just kind of the idea of middleware and integration, is something that I think is not as modern as it should be in a lot of the clients we're approaching, of how can we integrate data from all of our different silos and make sure that everyone is getting the surface data they need and it is actionable for them. Everyone across the entire enterprise, no matter what area they're in, has access to the same data and is able to action off of it.
Right. Well, I want to jump into that topic and a little more some other technical topics here in just a second. But before I do that, I want to ask a somewhat loaded question, because you just mentioned some of the things that CapTech does kind of across the board, and then the idea of bringing in some folks to facilitate things, that sort of thing. And I've often found if you bring in someone from the outside to start asking questions, start facilitating, that can be a really helpful approach. And so my loaded question, though, back to the Salesforce organization is, when should you think about outsourcing, something you're doing with Salesforce versus, ensuring that you have certain capabilities in-house? I see a lot of Salesforce orgs that are built around, really tiny numbers of people who are full-time employees, and then maybe like a constellation of contractors that are consistently there, and then sort of maybe they bring in consultants for projects and things like that. There are sometimes challenges with that. So if you sort of flip your roles around and you're one of CapTech's clients or a company that's considering what should I do in-house versus what should I outsource, what's the decision making process there? What kind of rubric should I be using?
And and I think at the outset of your question, talking about kind of those, bringing someone in from the outside to address those tougher questions that probably, and a lot of the theme of our conversation has been those silos of business versus IT and product versus sales. Ultimately, when things cross those silos, oftentimes organizations themselves have trouble bringing those people together because ultimately they serve different interests, they serve different stakeholders or different executives, and having someone from the outside come in and be properly empowered to kind of cross those silos and bring people together ultimately towards one stated vision from an executive level of, okay, this is on our executive roadmap. We need sales and IT to get together and get this done to make our company better. That is where I think we as CapTech have been able to come in and make the biggest impact, where it is kind of those cross-functional transformational projects, whether it be integrating Salesforce with a new ERP system or re-implementing your CPQ because your product suite has completely changed and therefore your sales team needs to sell it differently. Maybe you want to pivot your sales organization from a lead and opportunity-based model to more of an account-based selling. Those kind of sort of transformational organizational changes that have a lot of different stakeholders, that is where I would say, spending what is sometimes a higher dollar value on a consulting firm can make a significant impact and drive value. The most impactful projects from a pure driving dollar value perspective that we've done recently have been in Service Cloud. That is mainly because it is much easier to tie metrics to, whether it be customer retention, or I know that every minute my customer service person spends on the phone, that costs me, X dollars and cents. And if I reduce the call time through things like live chat or reduce the call volume through live chat, I know that I'm saving myself X amount. So, so things that you can tie true value to ultimately from a dollars and cents perspective, it's easy to rationalize a consulting firm, but those transformational cross-functional changes are, I think, where we've been able to make the biggest impact.
Got it. Okay. Well, so let's dive in a little bit more. I know you and I like to geek out on this stuff. So let's start with something that's coming up. I mean, Salesforce is releasing Spring 21 here in the next, or like maybe tomorrow or something. It's starting soon, I think. So, is there anything in particular you're excited about in the upcoming release?
Yeah, I think ultimately a tool that I don't play with as much as I would like it is Flow. And I know that in talking to you about the product you guys are building, you guys are focusing on Flow a lot, and it's been really encouraging to see someone that's so devoted to that, because ultimately in my mind that aligns so much with Salesforce's roadmap. So Flow is the number one thing that I'm the most excited about. I think that ultimately starting to fold in Process Builder to Flow, where it's kind of all under the same branding.
Right.
I think eventually Process Builders, it seems clear, Process Builder's going away. It's all going to be Flow. The idea that now flows can grab the old values of a record, kind of in the same way that database triggers do, where I can compare old value to new value. I'm seeing a future world where I could build an entire trigger architecture based in Flow that calls invoked Apex from there. I think that would be an incredibly admin-friendly way to move forward. Multi-column flow screens are impressive now. I think that's pretty cool. Better debugging, and then ultimately Lightning Web Components too. The idea that I can now do more local development in Lightning Web Components. I think Salesforce is a modern technology stack. The one thing that they're truly missing is local development. I think they've enhanced things from the DevOps perspective. The front end is much more modernized, but anyone that within CapTech that comes from maybe a Java background or a React or Angular background says, okay, well, how can I build things just on my local? Well, in the Salesforce ecosystem, it's a little tougher. And then also one that you and I talked about recently is quick actions with Lightning Web Components, which means that I can almost entirely forget about OR components, which is pretty cool from a developer perspective. How about you? Anything that you're seeing?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, we focus a lot on Flow, so I'm pretty excited about the new trigger stuff. Quite frankly, the the trigger functionality in Flow was a little bit weak previously because you couldn't check which fields had changed. And so that, you could trigger certain things when they happened, but it was difficult to actually do a delta and make sure that you only did something when this field was updated. So pretty psyched to see that. This is pretty esoteric, but we use custom property editors quite a bit, built in LWC. So basically flow actions themselves, when somebody's configuring a flow, an editor for a particular like Apex action. So that came out of beta, is officially coming out of beta, I believe, in spring 21. And so, if you do have pretty advanced use cases, that's really nice. I think they've also cleaned up the JavaScript API for that a little bit. It was a little bit janky before, so that's been good. I'm excited to see those changes. The quick actions thing is nice. I gotta say, like, whenever you're building into, there's still like these sort of rough edges, right? Where you're doing something in LWC and you're building a lightning component, and then suddenly you see, or you want to use one of the existing components, and suddenly you see that it's still like sort of Aura only. There's like a few places where that's still the case. So I'm glad to see that. I haven't actually seen the local development piece that you're talking about. I think that the SFDX development model that we've been using very heavily has, I think, made a lot of that, at least for us, kind of a non-issue, because we can, it's very easy to just build stuff in Scratch orgs. But I'm curious, I haven't seen that functionality. What's the local dev story there?
They've been doing local dev for a while, and I can admit I was reading through kind of highlights and saw this pop up. But I believe that you can now kind of access some basic Salesforce data in a local environment and kind of set that up where previously you couldn't do that at all. You couldn't access data at all, which in Salesforce makes kind of any idea of local development without accessing data or mocking data at least pretty useless. Mm-hmm. So I believe that kind of was the hump that they got over. But I can admit I need to read up on it a little bit more. The other one that I did see that I was excited about was SQL, which there are so many people that come from SQL to SQL and ask about things like select star and right. Why can't I do all these things in SQL why can't I do all these things in SQL that I could do in SQL? SQL has this new fields function where I can say field all and it will give me literally every field, which you and I have talked about kind of the Java ideals, which I don't come from a Java background, which I think you have a little bit of using like data access objects and kind of that model where we could use that a little easier if I was quickly and easily able to just say select fields all from account and then I've got my account now and I'm ready to roll. So that model seems like one that they're supporting a little further.
Yeah, I saw that, and I was, so shout out to Salesforce for implementing select star after all these years. So that's good. But I do wonder what the performance implications are going to be. I feel like there's going to be a bunch of devs who like toss in select fields all and, pull back. Not that I would know anything about like records that max out their or objects that max out their field allocations. But if you had something like that where you had 800 fields, I do wonder what the performance of that's going to be when you go grab 200 records or something like that. So be interesting to see how that works.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah,
Salesforce limits are always looming.
Yeah, they are. So I think the biggest thing for me with Flow, we talked about this earlier, is the line between a developer and an admin is blurring. And as I talk to a lot of admins, there's still sort of a wariness with Flow. I think some of them have embraced it fully, but some of them still want to fall back to Process Builder because I think it's a little. One, they've just used it more, but it's a little bit more constrained, right? Like it's less of the blank canvas kind of thing. It's like do this, then this, then this, and Flow is, it kind of moves away from that. And one of the things that I'm a little concerned about which I think you and I have talked about a few times, is, as you start building flows, it's incredibly powerful, and you're essentially building visually what used to be a fair amount of Apex code. And it brings up a whole host of questions for, the debugging workflows, which they're improving, but also sort of testing and correctness and how you validate for that. And I, so far, just haven't really heard much about any thoughts around that or what they plan to do around that. But, they have such, Salesforce has such strict unit test requirements, for example, on your Apex code. Well, if a flow does everything that a block of Apex would have done, how can you be sure that that's correct? And I don't think there's a great story around that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And something you and I talked about in the past was, okay, if we're going to move if I'm going to comb through your Apex of your org that you hire CapTech to come into, and I'm going to move all the stuff to Flow, I just got myself out of a lot of testing standards. So I just made my life a whole lot easier. And so ultimately, I think that having regression test standards that are automated in Apex, which I know is something you guys are working heavily on, really improves the standards for everyone. Of, these are my regression tests. This is my suite of regression tests in Apex, or even using some of the more modern JavaScript based testing frameworks that Salesforce does support now. These are my regression tests. If they don't run, I don't deploy. And truly sticking to those standards, probably that you would with any other modern web app, and truly treating it like that, whether you're doing it in Apex or you're doing it in Flow.
Yeah, and I think, I just think it's an interesting gap because there's, I think, a strong emphasis on testing, Lightning Web Components. There's a strong emphasis on testing Apex, but Flow sits in that space that is just sort of metadata, right? But it's more than that, and I think that's going to be something I hope they address. So speaking of, we've touched on SFDX. We mentioned that, and obviously speaking of metadata, I think one of the things that I think is really interesting about some of the investments Salesforce is making is a much more modern approach to DevOps. Taking some best practices around, continuous integration, regression testing, even down to this idea of scratch orgs, which I sort of think of as like it's sort of a throwaway environment, right? Which is pretty awesome, kind of container-esque, if you will, of just sort of this, like, I've got this like thin layer that I can go just build stuff off of. And then if I don't like it, I just throw it out and get a new one, right? What are you, I know there's some tooling that you all have used. I mean, what do you see as the future for building things at scale on Salesforce?
Yeah. Ultimately, it is going through CI/CD. That's the future of building. And you have talked to me about the paradigm you guys are shifting towards, where we always have a branch that is ready to deploy. And that is something that I think very few Salesforce orgs are at. And putting in sort of the webhooks and using a tool like a Jenkins or a Heroku to, okay, if I PR into the development branch, immediately what I'm going to do is I'm going to use SFDX CLI with some webhooks to go spin up a scratch org, run that set of regression tests, then test all my LWCs, test all my flows, like we mentioned, test all my Apex. If those pass, then okay, the pull request gets to the code review step. And then if ultimately my fellow developer code reviews it, approves it, okay, great. Then that deploys directly to my QA org via a webhook. And then if it passes all the tests there, I've still got my branch integrity that's always ready to deploy to production. The wrinkle with that is that works really quickly and easily when you're using Apex and using Lightning Web Components, and you've got developers that are probably more familiar with source control principles and using Git and probably using the command line. When you go towards the admin route, which using tools like Flow, like we talked about, that gets a little more hairy, and having admins that often come from a business background interact with source control principles is just foreign to them. So a tool we use a lot is something called GearSet. It's GearSet that has has fortunately been very open to our feedback, and we've worked closely with them. There's also tools like Capato and AutoRabbit that do similar things. Flowsome is another that are really able to compare org to org, source to org, whatever, scratch org to source, whatever kind of paradigm you live in from a development perspective, and allow me to see, okay, permission by permission, field by field, what is changing, and deploy accordingly. So, and interact with sources through a more user-friendly tool.
Yeah, I think there's got to be an understanding, as again the admin tools get more complex, of sort of how to better bring admins into that process, right? Because I was actually just having a conversation earlier with some folks who are investing quite a bit in Flow, and it has the same sort of version control needs and diff needs and those types of things that you would have with code. And so be interesting to see how that world evolves. But I certainly, it's been refreshing from our perspective as a team that's developing a managed package to be able to integrate with hooks in GitHub and build and test automatically on a PR like you were describing. So all that stuff is really nice, and I don't think would have been possible. Still lacks a little bit in some developer ergonomics. I defer to some folks on my team who had to get SFDX running inside GitHub Actions, but it does work, right? So yeah. It's an interesting shift. And then but I know that for you all, when you step into somebody's big hairy Salesforce org that's been around for a decade and has a decade's worth of different tools and stuff built into it, you don't have the luxury of using every modern modern thing, right? Because there's going to be something sitting around that does something you don't expect.
Yeah, no question. I think you guys as ISV partners are lucky. I think that the DX model is most definitely built for ISVs, or is more friendly to ISVs just by nature. The thing that I think, and I'd be open to any ideas you have on how to make source control more approachable for admins. I have been enthused by the fact that Salesforce has trailhead modules around source control now, which is kind of cool. It at least shows that they understand that they've got a gap there. But if I have a pull request that has a flow in it, I'm still looking at a 3,000 line XML file, and trying to diff that is pretty fruitless. So any ideas you've got on how you guys are managing PRs with the amount of flow you guys use would be great.
Yeah, it's not great yet. I mean, we probably are a little bit more okay at looking at XML if we ever need to. But does Gearset? I know Gearset has sort of metadata aware compares. Do they do a good job with flows in that way?
Not necessarily. And I think a couple of the other tools might do a better job of trying to interpret the XML into a flow. Mm-hmm. So what we've been doing, where if we have a complex flow that is up for code review, we'll actually schedule a session around it, usually cross-functionally between the client and our CapTech team, mm-hmm. which is a necessary evil sometimes. But the one thing that I will say Gearset does really well is permissions, is understanding permissions from a profile and permission set level, to where, I mean, if you look at a profile in a pretty complex org, you've got a 10 to 20,000 line XML file. So trying to diff that is impossible, where it actually breaks out permission by permission what you're actually gaining or losing for users. So that's been really impactful for us.
Well, that's super valuable, because messing that up can have pretty significant implications. So I can understand why that would be a place they would want to invest in. And then, well, look, this has been, I think we could probably go on for another, 2 hours on all the different, yep. DevOps pieces and different features. But this has been super valuable. I appreciate you kind of walking us through, sort of the high level all the way down into the weeds where we've been the past few minutes. So Stan, always great to talk with you, and I really appreciate the time today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on, Hayes. I really appreciate it, and talk to you soon.
Yeah, sounds good.